The culmination of our story from yesterday.
Yeah, we're in the 11th chapter of Mark today and the 20th verse. And if you'll remember yesterday, we had a rather different kind of story where Jesus curses a fig tree. There's a fig tree that looks like it is blooming. It is not blooming. It's not showing any fruit. And so Jesus says, no one should ever eat from you again. We followed that up with that story of Jesus cleansing the temple, which does provide some clarification. And then, you know, Michael, this next section in my Bible is called The Lesson from the Withered Fig Tree. And what you think, if you read that, is that Jesus is going to explain the fig tree.
Right.
It's not that. And if you go into this thinking, okay, this fig tree thing is now going to make complete sense, I think you'll likely leave the passage going, that's not what
you'll be a little disappointed.
Expected. There is a lesson, but it's typical of Jesus, maybe not the lesson we think we're going to get. So verse 20 here, in the morning they passed by, and they saw that the fig tree had withered to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Let's stop there, Michael. That we're not very far in, but this part is connected to that last story. And I think it should be, again, when Mark gives us a detail, it usually matters. That's true of most of the gospel. I think maybe all the gospels, but it's especially true, I think, in many instances in Mark. So he could just say the fig tree withered, right? And we could imply that he's talking about Judaism, the nature of religion in Jesus' day. We could assume that he's talking about the temple and the way that it is profiteering and abusing people. But Mark wants to go on to say it had withered to its roots. The whole thing is bad. The curse has been put upon it from top to bottom. It's not just, it is not just that it is having a bad season. It is completely dead. It may look alive, or did at one point look alive, but to the roots, it is corrupt. And I think that matters to Mark.
I'm trying to think, certainly not in our reading thus far, but I'm thinking of the other Gospels as well. Are there other stories where Jesus ostensibly, for lack of better words, curses a thing? I can't call to mind. We of course think of Jesus' healing power, his restorative power, but here it sticks out that this here is this prophecy against a thing that was alive is no more, and it is directly connected to the thing that Jesus said, the thing that Jesus did. I think that is striking.
Yeah, and the idea of bearing fruit, that the thing that has been cursed is a thing that bore no fruit, was barren. And yes, we can feel sorry for this tree, but this is a spiritual lesson in Mark. It's not about the tree at all. It's about bearing fruit, and what happens when you don't, you die to the roots. So then we'll continue. So Peter says, Rabbi, look, and verse 22 here, Jesus answered them, have faith in God. I tell you the truth, if you say to the mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. So the strange turn, or the unexpected twist here, is that Jesus doesn't talk about the fig tree. You think that maybe he's going to explain and give you some broader understanding of what's happening here, and he doesn't do that at all. He uses it as an occasion to teach the disciples the power of faith. And these verses are in the other Gospels, but they're placed strangely in Mark. The idea that they're a follow-up to this conversation is, I think, unique to Mark. And you have faith. In other words, Jesus says, the lesson here is if you believe, you can do acts of power. You can call things to account. You can throw mountains into the sea if you do not doubt in your heart. And on one hand, this is a really powerful promise. This is Jesus telling the disciples that they have access to a deep spiritual power that is effective and effective in the world. They can speak the power of God into the circumstances of their life, into the community. They can heal. They can do acts of power. That what faith connects them to is not just between them and God, but it can have an impact in the world around them. And to the positive side, Michael, this is encouraging.
Yeah, I think that most of us have probably heard this at some point in our time in the faith. It's a pretty well-known sort of teaching of Jesus. I would be a little surprised, though, if that same number had heard it put into this kind of context. It's a strange place to sort of run into it. And I actually really appreciate that, Clint. I think it's tempting to see this in red and to think that this is some sort of self-empowerment kind of affirmation, that Jesus is saying to the disciples, hey, if you just believe in yourself enough, you can do whatever you want. You can, like we tell our kids, on career day, you can, 16 kids in the class can be president. Well, truth is that's not true, but right, what's happening here isn't some sort of self-congratulation. It's not even really an encouragement at all for the disciples themselves. What it is a, I think, reminder to those who are receiving this letter that even the people on the far fringes can be brought into God's family if they but have faith. That God is capable of doing miraculous things if God's people have faith. And on the contrary, God has no time for faithlessness, for hypocrisy, for faith that is on the outside but that has dead roots. God has no time for that. All that God's interested in is the people who are willing to exercise faith in the God who wants to reach out and transform their lives. And so I think what's fascinating is, in my own personal faith, Clint, I think I'm very much sort of biased towards this text because I've heard this text preached numerous times about how this is the linchpin of how you get God to do things for you. You just have to have more faith. And I think what I find beautiful about Mark's telling is if you put it in the context of where it was and why Jesus was preaching it, it absolutely anesthetizes that. There's no sense in which this is about us and our personal betterment. It's all about God's faithfulness to respond to those who have enough faith to call out and ask for help.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality is there's been kind of a shadow side to this text, which has done some damage and been hurtful. When you tell the person whose loved one doesn't recover from an illness, or the couple whose pregnancy doesn't get miraculously healed and they lose a child, when you have those moments in which people have desperately cried out in prayer and what they prayed for doesn't come to pass, this verse has been used, I would say abused, as a club. And the answer that is sometimes given is, well, you must have had doubt in your heart, or, oh, that you didn't pray hard enough. And just as it's not about our power to do things, but God's power, it is also not a text about our failure and our inability. And it saddens me. I have seen, it's funny as you say that, Michael. I'm trying to think. I don't think that I ever heard this verse preached, and I'm not sure how often, if ever, I have preached it. I have probably preached it maybe once. But I think for a Reformed Presbyterian, this text scares us a little bit because we think that it has been abused by another family, part of our church family, who has used it in ways that seem irresponsible. And I don't mean to sound judgmental about that. I just think when you live with the secondhand question mark of, well, what about those moments we pray for that don't happen? What about those things that we put all of our faith in God, but God doesn't act the way we want God to, or doesn't bring about what we hoped? And those are hard moments. And the idea that that's sort of our fault has been really troubling, and I think makes us very, very nervous. And so it's interesting that in the Presbyterian version of the family, I don't think this is a very popular kind of text.
Yeah, you know, I think it all hinges on what we understand prayer to be on some level, because, you know, the truth is, and I've always thought this, that if we were to pray as Jesus has taught us to pray, I think our prayers would often sound far different than they do. And God is certainly interested in everything from the trivial things in our lives to the most important and pressing challenges of our lives. Of course, God cares about that whole range. But it seems that the scriptural examples of prayer are all asking God to align our hopes, dreams, desires with God's vision and intention for our lives. And if we're going to be honest, for most of us, that's a pretty challenging prayer to make, because it's hard to be reminded of the ways in which we don't measure up to God's best for our lives. It's hard and challenging to recognize that we may not know the answer or the outcome of a situation, but to pray, "Thy will be done," is a dangerous prayer. And I think that we are all helped when we come to a text like this and we see that even in Jesus' own words, what we do as people of faith does matter. And I do understand how that makes a Reformed person uncomfortable, because we emphasize so heavily God's work on our behalf, God's work that makes our work possible. But Jesus, he's not really interested in teasing out the same theology that we might years after what he teaches. What he says is plain and clear, that really we must just have the faith to speak, and that our prayer, if that prayer is rightly offered, will happen. If we focus on the thing that God invites us to step into, I think it's a very different thing than the temptations of culture, of acquisition of stuff, of making it in the job, of our 401k going up to the right at all times. I mean, these things are important humanly, but I'm not sure that's what Jesus has in mind here.
Agreed. And, you know, the concern that I bring to this text is for maybe an immature believer, a young believer, a new believer, to read this as some sort of guarantee that as long as I think God can do it, I get whatever I request. And certainly we know that's not the case. In fact, not many chapters from now, we're going to see Jesus desperately pray for something that he himself doesn't receive, and that matters. So a powerful text, but one with some asterisks on it. Then Jesus connects this little conversation of prayer to a single verse about prayer and forgiveness. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. Michael, Jesus does this a couple of times in the scripture, maybe most notably the Lord's Prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer. The fascinating and somewhat frightening connection between our willingness to forgive and our receiving forgiveness from God. And to put this in these terms is, I think it makes us catch a little bit, maybe makes us pause. When you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. And I think may here doesn't mean might. May means that the road is unblocked. So that if you're willing to give forgiveness, then you're able to receive forgiveness. I don't think that what Mark means here is that God is holding forgiveness as a reward. You do the right thing and I'll give it back to you. I think what he means is so that the way will be clear and you are forgiven. You can forgive your trespasses.
This is one of the hardest so that's in the Bible.
Yeah, very much. Mark is very blunt in this regard.
Yeah, there's really no sneaking out of this one. And I think I would only go one step further. I don't think that this is intended, though I think it's a fair next step in what I think Mark is presenting here. this kind of forgiveness requires the humility of confession. It requires that we recognize that we do wrong others. And it seems to me, as I survey our current moment, seems that we're having a hard time confessing as a culture, as a people. I think we live in a moment which the admission, I have done wrong, is something that is very sparsely done or said. And I think as Christians, we are called to it. The idea that when you're praying, forgive if you have anything against anybody, that requires the kind of humility to recognize that I need to let go of a thing I hold for this person. But I think it also follows that must, for us, require that we have to grapple with the fact that we too have missed the mark in holding those grudges. And it seems that we would all do well to practice some humility in our life.
What I think makes this powerful is that we so often characterize it, and rightly so, I think, experientially the other way. We receive forgiveness, so then we're able to give it. And by reversing those parts of the process, I think Mark makes a very powerful point, and it's hard to read that verse and not spend some time thinking about the need to offer forgiveness and work on the places in our hearts where we're not ready to do that yet. I think, again, Mark writes one verse and you could stop and think about it for a long time.
I've never had an 8th grade confirmation student say that Mark 11:25 was their favorite verse in the Bible. And I suspect that there's few people who would put this in their favorite verse category. But I'll tell you what, we would all do well to bookmark this one and return to it. This has a way of transforming a life.
So, in fact, you may, if you're looking at your Bible, if you have a study Bible, as mine is, I do not have a verse 26, and my Bible goes straight from 25 to 27.
Same.
And what that means, if you look at the footnotes, other ancient versions of Mark add verse 26, but if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses, which the earliest copies of Mark don't have. Whenever a verse drops out, it generally means that they found copies earlier than the ones they used to get that verse, and they realized that verse wasn't in there. So somebody along the way possibly couldn't pass up the temptation to soften this verse, to add to this verse a little bit. And so we go right to verse 27. This is a gotcha story. We've seen this before. I'll just read it quickly. There's not a great deal that's difficult to follow here. Again, they came to Jerusalem. He's walking into the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority do you do these things? Who gave you the authority to do them?" And Jesus said, "I'll ask you a question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by the authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven or from humans? Answer me." And they argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, "Why didn't you believe him?" But if we say of human origin, they were afraid of the crowd, for everyone regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." So I don't know if there's a lot theologically in this text. We have these moments where people try to outsmart Jesus, and it never works. They try to trap Jesus, put him in a corner. They try to get Jesus to have to answer a question in which both answers are problematic. And Jesus here just turns it back on them and says, "Okay, yeah, I'll answer your question. You first." And the people, they're afraid to say either thing. They know that Jesus has gotten them. So these wise and learned men, I have to admit, I have to imagine these words didn't taste very good to them. They said, "We don't know." And Jesus said, "Well, then I don't have to answer you. If you can't answer me." And the thing you have to understand about these questions is they're not real questions. The men come to Jesus already knowing the answer, and that's frustrating. We see that in politics. We see it in religion. We see it in these moments where it's not about learning something. it's not about discussing ideas. It's about painting Jesus into a corner and then beating him with his answer, literally besting him with his answer, not physically beating him, but winning with his own answer, making him say something that traps him. And Jesus, it just never works.
Yeah, the notable part of this is, though, Clint, that Jesus is standing in the temple, and it's the chief priests and the scribes. So we're not just talking about, local pastor from rural wherever. We're talking about the who's who. These are the notable religious leaders of the day that are trying to best Jesus, and he clearly wins this argument. And we're going to jump into this next week as we turn to the next teaching that happens. Jesus eviscerates the leadership. And it is maybe lost on us to a significant degree of how much animosity is present here. I mean, there is just, when you talk about the idea of the gotcha question, this isn't just like an intellectual spar. This isn't the philosophy department at the university trying to out-reason one another. There's some vitriol in this, and we may miss it in our reading, but things are really tense at this point in the Gospel of Mark.
We'll try to remind you of this Monday, but as we begin chapter 12, it's worth noting, excuse me.
Bless you.
It's worth noting that Mark will kind of intersperse these moments now. There'll be a story or a teaching, and then there'll be a question and some conflict. And we're seeing this ramp up as we move toward Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. And so this is kind of a snippet of that, but we'll see a lot more of this pattern. Jesus will say something, there'll be some teaching, there'll be maybe a story, and then they argue with him. We also want to point out that the cursing of the fig tree is the last act of power that Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark. So there aren't any miracles or healings told from this point. And again, I don't think that's an accident. I think Mark has left that out there because the fig tree, we understand that the fig tree is metaphorically the scribes and Pharisees.
Yeah.
And the curse against those who are abusing the faith and misusing God is the last thing Jesus does. That's the last word of his acts of power. And now we see the physical confrontation begin to escalate. So I'm sorry if that doesn't make sense. I think maybe it will as we move through these last few chapters.
I think that's a good place to stop. I hope that there's been something in the conversation for you today, and look forward to seeing you worship on Sunday and then Bible study again 2 o'clock on Monday.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
See everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome! We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.